All right, so for the introduction, the main problem that we are trying to figure out is that although the mass and height are kept constant, the overall shape of the object may impact velocity, as seen in the line paper example that we did in class. Hence, the goal of the experiment is to investigate how the velocity is affected by the shape of the Play-Doh. And our research question is, how are inelastic collisions impacted by the overall shape of the object? For the experimental design and setup, we had a ball of Play-Doh that had a mass of 0.0735 kilograms, and we had a person standing holding the Play-Doh that was formed into four different shapes: a round ball, a flat ball, a more round than flat ball, and a more flat than round ball. And the person stood there and used their hand to hold the Play-Doh at a height of 28 inches using a meter stick. Um, in order to keep this constant. Um, and like I said, the Play-Doh was released from the person's hand above the ground. Um, so the independent variable in this case is the height and the mass, as these are kept constant throughout, and the dependent variable is the velocity.
Okay, so in terms of physics models, the models that are relevant to our system being studied would include Newton's second law of motion, which states that acceleration of an object is proportional to its net force and inversely proportional to its mass. The law of energy conservation, where energy in a system is conserved, and the idea of momentum. Right, and then these were our position graphs for each ball or each Play-Doh shape. We put them in Tracker and then into Excel. So as you can see, the average velocities for the round ball was the greatest, and that for the flat ball was the smallest. And then we use the final velocity graphs to get the actual final velocity instead of the average. And so with that, we've still found that the round ball had the greatest final velocity of negative 3.54 times 10 to the negative first. And the flat ball had the smallest velocity of negative 3.06 times 10 to the negative first. But it is important to point out that we found that the more flat than round ball had a greater final velocity than that of the round ball. And then we found the final kinetic energy. The initial kinetic energy was the same in all different shapes because we were holding it. And so we found that the round ball had the greatest kinetic energy and the flat ball had the smallest kinetic energy. But again, the more flat than round ball had a greater kinetic energy than that of the flat ball or round ball.
Okay, so just to recap, we found that the round ball had a final velocity of negative 3.54 times 10 to the negative 1, and the flat ball had a smaller final velocity, and then the round ball had a greater final kinetic energy than that of the flat ball. So we saw that the flattest object had the smallest final kinetic energy value compared to all the other objects, which kind of provided evidence that more energy was lost internally, potentially due to air resistance compared to the round ball. However, it's important to acknowledge that the data for the more round than flat and the more flat than round is not as concrete, as we see that the final kinetic energy for the more flat than round was actually greater than the more round than flat. So the main findings, we basically provided some evidence that a round object will have a greater final velocity prior to the collision than a completely flat object, and thus the final kinetic energy of the round object will be greater than that of the flat object. And so the shape of an object impacts the inelasticity of the collision. And we can hypothesize that this may have been due to the fact that a flatter object loses more energy to air resistance, thus leading to a smaller final kinetic energy. And some important things to acknowledge: that more research is needed to explore exactly how object shape impacts collision inelasticity, because our results for the middle two shapes was pretty inconclusive. And our potential sources of error, we molded our objects by hand, which honestly isn't really ideal. And just issues with utilizing tracker and having to track the movement of the object as it fell can be oftentimes difficult. And yep, that is our project. Thank you.